we're clearing the room with the topic of payment. So before we get started...
All those other people have everything paid for.
They've got everything paid for. It's not a problem. So before we get started, I want to introduce Brent Vaughn, because this is really going to take the form of a fireside chat, and I will be interviewing Brent. Brent is CEO and co-founder of Cognoa. Cognoa is a pediatric behavioral health company that's developing prescription digital therapeutics to change the standard of care for early diagnosis and treatment of behavioral health conditions. And they've started with autism. So at Cognoa, Brent has built and led the team to develop the company's proprietary AI platform and has received breakthrough designation from the FDA for the company's 2 lead products, the first diagnostic and the first digital therapeutic for kids with autism. Prior to Cognoa, Brent co-founded Wellness FX, a digital health company that created direct-to-consumer diagnostics and a telemedicine platform. And before working on digital medicine, he had leadership positions in business development, product management at Chiron, Novartis, at Nectar, and Roche. So Brent has a lot of experience in a lot of different domains here. And I'll say just a couple words, because I'm going to be opining as well. As Nicole noted, I run Hope Lab. We're a social innovation lab that builds products and interventions to improve health and well-being for teens and young adults, tech-based products. We have a team of behavioral scientists, designers, and product developers and managers. And we take products out to market in partnership with organizations in education, healthcare, and the nonprofit sector. So we're building and testing digital interventions with and for teens and young adults. Prior to that, I spent many years in California Healthcare Foundation, where the last 5 years I started and ran a social venture fund. So I spent a lot of time looking at early stage companies in digital health and really thought a lot about how to take them to market, particularly in the safety net. But more importantly, how to take them to market and get them paid for anywhere. So one of the things I think it's important to emphasize as we get started is, regardless of whether you are trying to get paid for or sponsored by someone in the philanthropic sector, someone in the commercial sector, or a consumer, him or herself, this is a really important topic. And when we talk about demystifying the path to payment, the apology I'll offer at the beginning is saying we're going to demystify it, but I don't think we're going to make it any less challenging. I'm really happy, though, to kick off and interview Brent, because I think he does as good a job as anyone I've met in breaking down this very complex topic. So I'm going to actually just kick off and ask Brent to start off by telling us a little bit about his background and where his journey in health and wellness has taken him, and talk a little bit about what he's trying to do now with Cognoa.
Sure. Thanks a lot. My background is I started in pharmaceutical and medical device. So I worked for some of the big companies like Lilly and Roche, Chiron, also companies that were bringing innovative new technologies to help change the way that patients interacted with their meds. From that, I found myself working in a personalized medicine in the oncology space, and got a chance to start what we found out later would be a digital health company. We didn't really know we were called that when we started it, which was Wellness FX. And I met a person who had built the consumer side of WebMD, and he wanted to build WebMD for healthy people. And he kept trying to explain to me what this was, and I kept explaining to him how it wouldn't work. And then one day he said, well, why don't you come join me and let's find a way to make this work? And that became Wellness FX. We decided that it would be powerful and interesting and hopefully a good business to empower people with in-depth diagnostic knowledge that they could use to plot a better health and wellness path. And so ultimately, we ended up having a HIPAA-compliant practice of medicine in 47 states, where we were integrated into both Quest and LabCorp. And anyone who joined Wellness FX could download the app on their phone, and with an Amazon-like storefront experience, they could buy advanced cardiovascular or metabolic diagnostics, and then show up at a Quest or LabCorp location in any city the next day, and use their phone like getting on an airplane, and be able to have their blood drawn, and then use that for a high-content telemedicine. And so had we been clever enough to think that we were the MD squared at an Amazon price, we maybe would have sold the company for more. But I think we learned a number of things there, right? We learned some things about what it takes to start to build a direct consumer, getting patients to actually pay for healthcare, even highly motivated patients, and what it takes to scale that, and how hard it is to raise money for a healthcare product that you think patients are going to pay for.
Yep. Let's ask a question of the audience before we dive into this next piece about payment. How many people here have a company that they are working on trying to take to market or that they're taking to market now? Okay. And how many of you are thinking about consumers as your payers? And how many of you are thinking about commercial payers? Okay, so a lot of you thinking about both of them. Yeah. So yeah, why don't we actually move on? I think one of the things, we want to talk about payment today, we want to talk about adoption, and we want to talk about paths, different paths to payment. And I think Brent does a better job than anyone I have ever heard, sort of laying out a thesis about this question of who do you think is going to pay, and based upon that, how do you actually develop the company and take it to market?
Thanks. I hope I do it well today. So I think that who is going to pay for your product, if you're starting a company in this space, especially in healthcare, because healthcare is one of those places where sometimes the customer, the decision maker, and the person who pays for it can be quite different, right? And sometimes not even located in the same place. The most important question to figure out is who is going to pay for your product, and to be quite thoughtful about it, because it will shape everything. If you think that the person that's going to pay for your product is third-party payers and Medicaid, Medicare, which is what we're doing in the autism space with Cognoa, then that means you're going to need to go down the path of being able to get FDA approval. You're going to have to run randomized clinical studies. You need to take money from people who believe in investing in regulatory and clinical risk. You are going to need to build a group that figures out how to engage with payers and payer coverage and provider adoption. If you think you're going to be selling to the people that were just sitting up here, right? If you're going to go down the path of wanting to sell to employers, then you will need some degree of clinical validation, right? I've met a number of those folks. I've sat in Abby's office and talked to her before, right? The number of different solutions that are all exciting and interesting and clinically validated that she sees every year, right? There's just not enough time in the day to even act on a small percentage. So you're going to need to have a degree of clinical validation, but your company is going to look very different. You're going to want to take money from people that understand. You have to build the type of sales and marketing execution that people like Vaughn have built, right? And if you think you're going to go down the path of selling to patients, then you're going to end up taking money from someone who understands how to build direct consumer acquisition and direct consumer scaling. And if you're from, it's funny, everybody thinks the thing that the other person does is easy, right? Michael Jordan thought he could hit a curveball. Turns out a little harder, right? It turns out there's lots of people in healthcare that are like, just sell it to patients. How hard can consumer be? I don't know, go over to a big consumer company who's spending $10 million a month on acquisition, ask them how hard this is, right? It's really freaking hard. There's a lot of people on the consumer side that, we're just going to get employers to buy it because it'll make all of their employees more engaged and healthy. Turns out B2B sales in a Fortune 500 environment, not trivial either. So understanding who it is, and we had kind of our own journey at Cognoa to figure this out, but understanding who's going to pay for it will actually help you understand how to build the company. And if you end up taking money early on from people who are consumer tech, and then you decide that you want to pivot and you want to run a 500-patient randomized clinical study to get FDA approval, you might find that you have de-risked everything, but your investors aren't willing to write that check because they just don't understand that space.
Right. No, that's really helpful. And let's actually kind of continue down that path, because we were talking, there are a lot of companies upstairs here. I go to a lot of digital health conferences. We've heard there are many as 500 digital therapeutics products, just digital therapeutics, across about 200 companies. I mean, at least based on public announcements, there are only about 5 digital therapeutic products that have ever been given FDA Breakthrough status, and you've got 2 of them. So talk a little bit about what drove this accomplishment, and how you've thought about validation and payment, and how that has played out as you've gone out to market to your potential customers or your initial pilot customers.
Sure. I think with Breakthrough, Breakthrough is actually pretty simple.
Yeah, say a little bit about what Breakthrough status is.
So Breakthrough, and for those of you who are wondering about whether or not an FDA approval path to be an approved software as a medical device is actually something you want to do, it sounds daunting, but the government prints the rule book, right? It is 21 CFR, it's the Code of Federal Regulations. They will actually explain to you what the process is. They'll tell you what category you're in, and you can go out and they'll have meetings with you and tell you how to do it, or at least tell you if your plan is good, right? They may not tell you how to do it, but they'll give you feedback. So it's not as daunting as you might think it is. And I would argue at the end of the day, although it is quite difficult, so is direct-to-consumer, so is selling to employers. They're different types of difficult, right? And so you kind of decide the one decide which one's you're gonna want to get out of the bed in the morning and tackle, right? But I think when you think about Breakthrough, Breakthrough only has two criteria to it. It's pretty straightforward. It is defined as a product that addresses a chronic or debilitating condition for which no current alternative exists, right? And so when we looked at, since we started with the autism space, there never has been a medical device to diagnose autism. The average age that a parent sees the signs and symptoms is 18 months, and they spend on average almost 3 years before they can get a diagnosis because they get referred from specialist to specialist to specialist, and pediatricians can't diagnose it because they don't have a tool to use. So ours will be the first tool that they can use to diagnose in their office. In terms of treating, when it came time to come up with our therapeutics so that we can use a digital therapeutic to treat the kids we diagnose, half of our Breakthrough was already written. It's the same debilitating or chronic disease condition, right? And now we had a different therapeutic intervention, but once again, there's never been a therapeutic approved for the space. And so if you start with the unmet need, I think in healthcare, I was told early on, advances in healthcare do two things. They improve patient outcomes and they lower cost, right? And at the end of the day, you should be thinking about how you're going to do those two things if you're really in healthcare, right? And so when you think about improving patient outcomes, if you do it in a place where that unmet need is very, very crisp, and it's not just an underserved need or a crowded need that you can do incrementally better, but it's truly an unmet need, that at least gives you a chance to go after things like Breakthrough.
That's right. So I'm watching, this is a speed round, so I'm going to go actually into another topic that when I talked with Nicole about beforehand, and certainly when I talk to early stage companies, is always an important one, which is validation, types of validation that different kinds of payers are looking for. And I know what's great about your background is you've worked in the wellness space. This is actually more squarely in healthcare. Mm-hmm. When you think about the questions we often get are, what kind of a study do I have to do? How big does my study have to be? What level of validation am I going to need to show? And we had a panel up here just before this that were HR, kind of employer folks, and those can be difficult questions to get the answer to. Right. So share your wisdom with this group. What have you learned in going to different parts of the market about what you've needed to be able to show them from a validation perspective?
Yeah, I think that you need to think about who's the champion going to be for your product in whatever organization you're ultimately selling into. So if you are trying to sell to Abby and the team that were just up here, who's going to be the person that really signs off on it? And then what's it going to take to kind of convince them? It turns out with the FDA, it's going to be a big statistically significant plan, right? And they can kind of start to walk you through it. I think that one of the things that, whether you're doing an FDA study or you're doing a study just for a direct consumer product, think hard about the endpoints. People often worry about how big their study is going to be or how long it is. Think about the endpoint that would be most compelling. Think of the slide that you want to be able to put up in front of the head of total rewards or whatever of saying, this is why everyone's going to want to pay for this product. And then your job in your study is to figure out how to generate the data that supports that slide.
And so talk about, what is your endpoint for Cognoa?
Yeah, so ours is, it's pretty technical, right? So we are.
Good in lay language.
Yeah. But so we are going to be able to show a minimum level of positive predictive value and negative predictive value. So when a physician uses our device, the FDA doesn't care about sensitivity. They don't care about specificity because they find those are misleading, right? What they want is what's your positive predictive value and what's your negative predictive value for being able to produce in our case, a diagnosis of autism.
Diagnosis of autism. Right? So how well are you able to predict a diagnosis of autism?
Right. Because they want to know how many patients the physician is going to be able to diagnose correctly versus pass on. When we look at our digital therapeutic uses augmented reality to show the child how to start better recognizing and engaging in social emotional states. And so what we do is we reinforce networks, developing networks in the brain to build sustainable differences in the ability to do social emotional recognition and reciprocity. So for that, we spend a lot of time looking at psychological instruments that measure those exact outcomes in kids, and then we can show from a baseline versus an endpoint that the child has improved similar or greater than they would have in, say, a year of therapy.
Great. So you're doing with Cognoa, but it's interesting, I think, because again, in the companies that are represented here, we have folks who are looking at the diagnostic side and others who are looking at the treatment side.
Right.
And what I'm hearing you say is that on both the diagnostic side and the treatment side, you need to have these endpoints. And I mean, I can certainly emphasize from having been on the receiving end of a lot of pitches and from coaching a lot of companies, being as clear about what that value proposition is as, you know, you can call the endpoint basically the value proposition, right?
Right, and there's crossover, right? If you have a strong background, we have people that came out of consumer that are working for us. They understand MAUs, they understand DAOs, they know what MAUs over DAOs should be. They understand how to start to drive engagement. Engagement is seldom, unless you're an engagement platform, right, which is a tough space, right? Engagement is seldom an endpoint into itself. But if you really understand consumer engagement, then that can be how you ultimately get to achieve your outcomes.
Terrific. So I'm not going to dive into one of the reasons. So there's lots of reasons why these things are important to early stage companies, and some of them are about ultimately having impact on the populations you're trying to serve. Some of them are about raising the money you need to raise to get there. We're going to be, there's a panel right after this one, or a discussion at least, about what are investors looking for. So we'll focus with our last few minutes just on thinking about being really clear about the impact and the impact that you can have. And I want to actually go back. We've talked about Cognoa and autism, but a lot of folks here are more interested and more engaged in wellness. And so when you think about, based on the experience that you've had, when you think about the wellness space and how metrics are either there or emerging, how do you think about that? How can people be as clear as they possibly can about the value proposition or the benefit, both to society and to an investor, of a wellness intervention?
Yes, I think that's tough, right? Because it is a very crowded space for any of you folks that are in it. When we did Wellness FX, we would look at what % engagement we had, how many return users you would have. If someone did Wellness FX, what % of them would come back? And we learned that if someone came through and did it once, about half of them will come back. If they came back a second time, an incredibly high probability would do a third and a fourth time, right? And so you start to look at engagement, you start to look at retention. But I still think the endpoints are quite important, right? Because at the end of the day, someone is going, unless you have some unobtainium or some IP position you've built, someone's going to come up with a similar version of your product or service, and they're going to be willing to charge less for it, right? Keep in mind, when you're starting companies, you're constantly competing with people who are in the process of going out of business, right? And so I think that if you look at people like Livongo, look at people like Amada, Canary, right? In the diabetes space, they are not going down the path of FDA approval, right? They're not trying to be a software as a medical device like us. They've got employers to pay for their products and services at scale. And they've done it by coming up with endpoints that are incontrovertible. A1C, mean blood glucose, weight, although sustainable weight loss is tough, right? So if that's your business model, more power to you, but it's a hard one, right? But still, I think you want to come up with harder versus softer endpoints, and then use the softer endpoints around retention, engagement, acquisition, to then bolster why you're the right solution to get to those endpoints.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll add to that from our experience at Hope Lab is we're working, so for instance, one of the things we're working on is an intervention for college students, and it targets loneliness as a precursor to and predictor of depression, anxiety, suicide. So it's a proximal metric. And so one of the things we also look at is being really clear, if you're going to use a proximal metric, about what that impact pathway looks like. And so if what we really need to demonstrate is that we can impact anxiety or depression, how do we show that we can get to a proximal metric, something like loneliness, that predicts anxiety or depression? So I think as I think about this broader space, the space where there aren't the HbA1cs or the really clinically clinical validation points, and we're thinking about more of the psychological metrics, really being clear about what your impact pathway and hypothesis is, I think can also be helpful.
Yeah, and I think when you're looking at these proximal metrics, you've just got to take a hard look and not confuse correlation with causality. If you can show a nice discussion of causality, especially in mental behavioral health, right? Mental behavioral health, I think, is the area where digital therapeutics have the best chance to become primary line of therapy, right? If you think about, yes, Livongo's done quite well, Amato's doing quite well, but the pharmaceutical interventions that we use in the diabetes and prediabetes market are so entrenched, they're going to be the majority share players when we are all long gone, right? But in mental and behavioral health, in kids, we have things that we have very few indications where we actually have things that work. In the areas like ADHD where things work, we wish we could use them less, and the same thing in adults. So if you find yourself in the mental and behavioral health space, I think you're uniquely positioned to have an intervention that could become primary first line of care and actually could displace pharma because we misuse pharma in this space so much.
Good. Well, we are over time. The great news, as I said, is the next speaker who's coming up is going to talk a little bit about what investors are looking for. So hopefully this has been a good introduction. Join me in thanking Brent.
Thanks.
That was a week-long course condensed into about 12 minutes or whatever it was. Yeah. So lots more to talk about, but you know, wishing everybody great luck on your paths to payment. And you know, I don't know how long you can stick around, but if people have a couple of questions, we're happy to answer them off to the side.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.